Good morning, everyone. This is installment 3 of Portrait of a Lady. So far as I can recall, we stopped somewhere near page 88. I clearly lost my sticky notes, so that's where we're going to begin when we get to the novel. However, I have a few things for you that are worth including because they give us more insight into Henry James himself and to this investigation of the American in Europe. This is the conclusion of a piece that I read some parts of last week. This is I forget her name, Charlotte Bean, and in a volume of Critical Insights. As a writer who belongs to no one nation or cultural group, James not only shaped the notion of the American writer in exile, but also worked towards establishing a new category for himself. He defined American to mean something different when applied to expatriates or even simply to those who spent a large portion of time overseas. He also manifested a certain degree of internationality about himself, his fiction, and the example of someone who lived abroad. Still, it is in such works as Daisy Miller, The Europeans, The Americans, and The Portrait of a Lady and The Wings of the Dove that James exemplifies the dilemma of young Americans to struggle against old world values, both in private and public relationships. As our story is unfolding, that is indeed what we are seeing in Isabel, but also to a degree in other characters. Writing in 1882, noted American critic William Dean Howells also said of James, "If we take him at all, we must take him on his own ground, for clearly he will not come to ours. We must agree then to take what seems a fragment instead of a whole, and to find when we can a name for this new kind of fiction. It is not simply a cultural contrast that preoccupies James, but a sense that the newness, the inexperience of the United States is somehow dependent upon its understanding, its potential to learn from European society and culture. James not only believed in this potential, but also lived it, living out as he did the dilemma of the young American abroad, living as a writer in exile, even as, in the end, he would be buried and blended in the American earth from which he comes." So I think that is um, more of an articulation of this, um, the, the, the examination of the American in Europe. Uh, then this is from the introduction to Portrait of a Lady by Gabriel Braunstein. Um, um, this volume also contains some reviews of Portrait of a Lady when it was published. Um, I'm either going to do that today or I may come back to it at the end of class. Jane found this for me, and it's worth examining again. After having been serialized simultaneously in Macmillan's Monthly in England and the Atlantic magazine in the United States, The Portrait of a Lady was published in 1881 when Henry James was 38 years old. I didn't realize he was that young until I started reading up on this novel. The novel marks something of a midpoint in James's career, coming close on the heels of his first great success, Daisy Miller, and well before the architecturally intricate novels of his later years, The Ambassadors, The Wings of the Dove, and The Golden Bowl. If Daisy Miller was James's first popular work, establishing his reputation, on both sides of the Atlantic, The Portrait of a Lady was, in the words of critic F.O. Matheson, his first unquestioned masterpiece. The short, spare Daisy Miller introduced to a large audience James's great theme, the conflict between American innocence and European sophistication, and also his great subject, the American girl abroad. She's an American girl, sings out Daisy's younger brother before Daisy made her first appearance in a Swiss resort town. The portrait of a lady is an expansion and a complication of the themes of the earlier novel. If in Daisy Miller, James wrote, as Rebecca West famously put it, like a piper carefully playing out a tune, the portrait of a lady is a more orchestral piece. It is nearly 5 times as long, with many more characters and scenes, and a plot of such complexity that it allows for many more dips and rises, harmonies, choruses, and movements. The music was revised by James in 1906, and this is the version you hold in your hands. So we are, as you know, we're looking at the older version, but this still illustrates some of these major points. The portrait of a lady is often discussed as a novel of manners, a sociological study of the contrasts in mores and styles of Americans and Europeans. It is also described as a psychological novel, charting the complex interplay between the minds of its major characters and exploring relentlessly and finally the consciousness of its heroine, Isabel. And remember, I remarked last week that we often come across those Jamesian paragraphs that are extremely long, but they are also interesting in the insight we get into the character that he is investigating. But these characterizations, while not entirely mistaken, obscure a central characteristic of the novel. The Portrait of a Lady is a fairy tale, or as James put it in the 1906 preface, a fable. With whatever authority he presents the psyches and social milieus of his Europeans and Americans, and Europeanized Americans, and that's Mr. Touchette to a degree, and however carefully he observed the locales and the authority and care are absolute. The project of the Portrait of a Lady is about as close to a work of social science as it is to a conventional potboiler. Americans and Europeans in the novel are types. As Leon Edel, James's great biographer and critic, has it, in James's fiction, Americans are often presented as if they are as if they still possess the innocence of Eden. And we see innocence in Isabel, especially early on where we are now. And furthermore, says Edel, it is striking how often the adjective corrupt precedes the word Europe. So you have to pay attention to that. Later on in today's chapters, we see London portrayed as kind of dirty and grimy, even in spite of its history. Uh, let's see. As they appear in the Portrait of a Lady, these representatives of the old and new worlds are rendered vividly, and they may feel to the reader momentarily real, but in the end they are figures in the novelist's dreams and meditations. They are as conceptual as they are concrete. Similarly, American Girl is not a category of mind or state of consciousness. It is a kind of representational ideal. In the author's terms, the phrase American Girl is almost redundant. Both words conjure innocence and, in their way, beauty. Both words also augur doom. If, as Edel argues, America is an Eden, then a fall will come, and surely, as a girl will become a woman or die, like Minnie Temple. The phrase American Girl also carries with it a hint of contradiction, a fight between two worlds. While an American is liberated, a girl is subject to all kinds of boundaries and limits. Notice, as you are reading, how many times James refers to Isabel as a girl. Later on, she insists that she is not in her first bloom of youth. I think we see that today. Then is a phrase that conjures a story, a cheerful two words that together gather great storm clouds. American girls are doubly doomed among the limits of European society. That is important. The limits of European society. An American girl going to Europe is a pure white lamb bound to be ruined. And though I think that that is a little towards the categorization of the characters in here, I do think it sheds some light on the place that the American girls, American young women, play. As I said, I'll get maybe this, we'll do this later today. No, I think it's interesting. Let's look at it. Just one. Um, the New York Times, um, let's see if this one's got a date on it. Yeah, in December 1881, said the London Spectator has recently devoted a very serious review to the charming sketch by Mr. Henry James, The Portrait of a Lady, criticizing its agnostic or atheistic tone. The reviewer acknowledges the wonderful skill of drawing the delicate touches of color in this portrait, but finds it wanting in those higher and more serious elements which should make it an enduring work of art. Because retrospectively, we know that this became one of his greats. The school of art is described as agnostic and unknowing of anything but what appears and is tangible in everyday life. In other words, an unreligious or atheistic tendency. This was a period of time, as I have said before, where the development of science was beginning to distance people from religion. It had been primary in everyone's minds until this development of science took some of that away. And this is what this critic is suggesting. Is Mr. James fairly open to the criticism of the English reviewer? The old idea that a novel must have a distinct moral or religious object is now mainly given up. It is required of a modern novel that it should be a picture of life, and that the retributions on crimes and sins should not follow any more distinctly or directly than they do in everyday experience. Even the old and very satisfactory theory of the novel that it should dispose of all the characters in the end and either marry or put an end to the heroes and heroines is not now carried into practice. I don't think that gave away the end. Um, the modern novel ends like a chapter in real life with a very uncertain denouement. That is something that Henry James does in the end in this novel. We don't get it all tidied up the way you had in the past. The good are not made happy or the bad punished any more than in real life. Things are left at the close in a very uncertain and confused condition. So far, real life is followed. But among those of Anglo-Saxon blood, this theory is not still further carried out, and the realistic French school imitated, which would lead no distinction between the moral and the immoral, between vice and virtue, filth and purity. So that is really the way real life is presented. We don't get any great songbird with a banner saying, "This is your moral condition." He is thoroughly refined and pure in every detail. But in the deeper experience of life, it cannot be denied that he writes as one who knows very little of this part of human existence. Um, I don't agree with that necessarily, but I do think that the moral element of that has been subsumed to the psychological development of these characters, and we get people the way we really get people in that it's all through other people's eyes that we see how people respond. Um, there's another one in here from the Atlantic Monthly, but I'm going to parcel these out a little bit so we can get to the book. One more thing, though. Henrietta. We left, so far as I can remember, We left somewhere around page 88. Hope so. But Henrietta is now being developed to a degree. She appears on page 88. We'll just hold that thought. Henrietta's sense of self. Oh, I'm back in Gora. Um, Henrietta's sense of self-reliance has one limit. Almost the first thing she says is that England makes her feel cramped, and she soon falls into an argument with Mrs. Touchette. We have different points of view, Isabel's aunt says. I like to be treated as an individual. You like to be treated as a party. Um, she was part of, Henrietta came over on the boat as part of a party. Henrietta denies this. She claims to be treated as an American lady. Yet she has indeed spoken of traveling with a party she met on the steamer, a lovely group from Little Rock, and however comically handed, their dispute points to an ideological crack in the center of American life through Henrietta. For how can anyone be somebody in particular in a land of certain self evident truths? How much can any one individual be allowed to stand out? On the one hand, we share a belief that belief in a Republican egalitarianism. We are all equal. On the other hand, we each have the freedom to pursue our own individual happiness. Towards the end of our chapters today, Isabel says that she has the right to be free. Um, it is a freedom that quickly produces both a fierce sense of competition and the social divisions that rise from it. The historian, oh, wait, I'm just going to go on. Still, the implicit three-way debate between Isabel, Henrietta, and Mrs. Touchette cuts more sharply than that. It is, above all, a dispute about the nature and limits of desire. Tocqueville had warned that individualism may undercut any sense of public good, and when pushed to an extreme, the pursuit of personal freedom that stands as an integral part of American identity does indeed end by putting one at odds with the nation as a whole. There is nothing more American than wanting to choose, Isabel, and the most American thing of all is to insist upon choice, upon one's right to break the social compact. From that, Henrietta draws back. Self-reliance cannot go unfettered, and choice has its limits. Limits that mark out one kind of American identity, sacrificing individual eminence to purchase a Main Street cohesion. I thought that was really, really relevant because of all this that's going on with the COVID shots. On the one hand, I have people in my jail classroom who insist that they are not going to be vaccinated. And since my other position in that room is to teach civics, I can't get anyone to understand that there is that line between your personal freedom and where it impacts the larger society as a whole. So there's no absolute definition between the two. There's no absolute line. It isn't obvious. But James's conception of Henrietta as a secondary figure here keeps him from engaging with these issues as fully as he might. Later chapters have deeper things to say about the terms of American identity, but let me suggest one of the ways in which he tries to finesse them. Isabel thinks Ralph as a cosmopolitan, and that is in fact on page 88. Someone marked by a culture that transcends linguistic and national borders. Henrietta merely calls him alienated, which is simplistic, and asks if he thinks it right to give up his country to live abroad and with foreign manners. And remember, he is more anglicized, I suppose it will, than his American father. His answer is quite simple and speaks perhaps for James as well. He tells her that he can no more give up his country than one gives up one's grandmother. It's antecedent to choice. Um, he doesn't stop being an American just because Oxford has swallowed up Harvard. And in one sense, he might even be more of one as the expatriate. Isabel finds a deep appeal in Garden Court's sense of well ordered privacy, but the pleasure she takes in it is conditioned by her national origin. So, whereas the Touchettes think of Garden Court as maybe a little too quiet, of course, the Touchette men have to remain quiet because they're both so ill. Um, but because of her national origin, Isabel can fully enjoy it, of liberty on which she depends and by which she lives. James himself had spent a decade in making that place his own by the time he sat down to tell her story in his hotel room overlooking the Arno in Italy. He had tested its attractions and had even given his homeland one last try before making a final declaration of independence. In settling in the old world, he had paradoxically left behind his past, and for Isabel Archer, as indeed for James himself, the consummation of her utterly American desire to choose will be to elect a European home. So, um, oh, this is my book. I thought I had written in Jane's book. Um, so we'll come back to Gora. He provides us quite a lot of very nice insights. And if we return to the novel on page 88, a third of the way down, I can't remember if I got to this point or not quite. Um, Miss Stackpole is trying very hard to understand Ralph, but she just can't. She just doesn't get him. Um, the languages are nothing. I mean, the spirit, the genius. I am not sure that I understand you, said the correspondent. That's Henrietta of the interviewer, but I expect I shall before I leave. He is what is called a cosmopolitan, Isabel suggested. Isabel's coming to Ralph's rescue to a degree. That means he's a little of everything and not much of any. I must say, I think patriotism is like charity. It begins at home. We see her um, trying to puzzle out these aristocrats and some of the rules, and she just doesn't get it. Um, about 10 lines down. Well, sir, I haven't quite made up my mind what ground I shall take. I feel a good deal cramped. So whereas we know this in the United States by this time, by the 1880s, um, America had a lot of territory, and we hear James a couple of times refer to England as a little tiny island. Certainly, by comparison, it is, but the largeness of the territory we possess, or in which we inhabit, gives us a different than point of view of the English. I think may have said this in a class or two, that in some ways English novels examine a character's return home, whereas American authors examine the the journey away. And that's where Isabel is. This is on her journey. Henrietta, not so much. Um, she feels cramped by the history. A few lines later, in spite of that, I felt cramped. I felt something pressing upon me. I couldn't tell what it was. I felt at the very commencement as if we were not going to sympathize with the atmosphere. So we know that for a good deal of the novel, she is not going to sympathize. Over on the top of page 89, she's here on a mission. This correspondent to the interviewer. And that mission is to meet English people and write them up in her magazine. Isabel speedily found occasion to request her to desist from celebrating the charms of their common sojourn in print. She doesn't want them to be written about. But Miss Stackpole was going to call it Americans and Tudors, Glimpses of Gardencourt. Miss Stackpole, with the best conscience in the world, offered to read her letter to Isabel, who immediately put in her protest. I don't think you ought to do that. I don't think you ought to describe the place. Figuring that if she does describe the place, it will in some ways take the soul from it. And she says that her hosts will think of it as a breach of hospitality. Down on page 89 towards the bottom. You know I am deeply human, Isabel. I always was. And I wrote in the margin, well, who isn't? Of course she's deeply human, but I am too. We all can raise our hands with that. Miss Stackpole rejoined, I was going to bring in your cousin, the alienated American. There is a great demand just now for the alienated American, and your cousin is a beautiful specimen. Henrietta often uses that word specimen, and it comes from this new science. One examines things by looking at specimens. I should have handled him severely, she says. He's a type of specimen. Next page at the very top. Um, Isabel looked at her companion in much wonderment. It appeared to her so strange that a nature in which she found so much to esteem would exhibit such extraordinary disparities. My poor Henrietta, she said, you have no sense of privacy. Um, you know that Henrietta, of course, is a representation of the new American in Europe, much of which Europeans couldn't comprehend. Next paragraph, I am very sure of that, but it seems to me one should be modest for others also. Henrietta is not modest for others. Um, and I wrote in the margin, um, discretion is the better part. I couldn't read my handwriting. The discretion is the better part of valor. Henrietta does not know that. Um, on page 90, at the end of that bigger paragraph in the middle, Miss Stackpole exclaimed, I must get a glimpse of the nobility, again seeking specimens. And Lord Warburton will perhaps offer another example, another specimen. At the top of page 91, Henrietta, on her side, did not quite justify Isabel's declaration with regard to her indifference to masculine opinion, for poor Ralph appeared to have presented himself to her as an irritating problem, which it would be superficial on her part not to solve. Again, Ralph now is the specimen. She doesn't get it. Uh, he does nothing, Isabel said, smiling. He's a gentleman of leisure. This is in direct contrast with what we value in this country, which is hard work. It's what Touchet represents, the utilitarianism of work. And if you know anything about the aristocracy, one's best to um, to inherit one's wealth. So a one might have a career, but and we've seen this in other novels, one really doesn't have a career. It's a little ungentlemanly. Um, Down at the bottom of page 91, she wants to expose Ralph to Isabel so that Isabel can see, as she says, she will see how thin you are, as if there's nothing there, no substance. Now, over on page 92, in the middle of that incomplete paragraph, this young lady, indeed, to do her justice, was but little addicted to the use of conventional phrases. Um, there was something earnest and inventive in her tone, which at times, in its brilliant deliberation, suggested a person of high culture speaking a foreign language. Few lines later, but she appeared, in spite of this fact, to carry in her pocket none of the small change of admiration. So they've now moved into this gallery where all the paintings are. She just doesn't, she's not even exclaiming, oh, the beauty of this, and that's lovely, and she doesn't say any of that. Um, let's see, suddenly, just after he had called her attention to a charming constable, she turned, those are landscapes. She turned and looked at him as if he himself had been a picture. Uh, that's exactly what she's doing. She's thinking to herself, oh, this is an interesting specimen. And he says, I am the idlest man living, which of course is something that's valued. Down at the bottom, I don't see how you can reconcile it to your conscience, she said. And on page at the top of page 93, one doesn't give up one's country any more than one gives up one's grandmother. It is antecedent to choice. So he is not denying his Americanism. That's something you should star. That's made quite a bit of in the criticism. So she wants him to go home and take right hold of something, work in the Benjamin Franklin kind of way. Um, we've never read this in this class, but the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin really pretty much defines the American point of view because Benjamin Franklin does just that. He has humble beginnings and he brings him up in the proverbial by his bootstraps. She just can't figure him out. But she'll figure importantly later. Down at the bottom of 93, you are not serious, Miss Stackpole remarked. That's what's the matter with you. But for all this, in a day or two, she again permitted him to fix her attention, and on this occasion assigned a different cause to his mysterious perversity. I know what's the matter with you, Mr. Touchette. She says you think you are too good to get married. She doesn't seem to realize that um, he probably isn't going to be able to marry given his TB. She says on the next page, it's everyone's duty to get married. And in the middle of that same paragraph, she was wanting in distinction, but as Isabel had said, she was brave, and there is always something fine about that. He had not supposed her to be capable of vulgar arts, but these last words struck him on a false note. So he can't really figure her out either. Over on page 95, about a quarter of the way down. She told me she thinks there is something very low in the tone of Europeans towards women. One of the things that we're going to see examined later is the position of women. And this is an American woman in Europe, but she thinks that the view of women in Europe, it's the old view. It's what later we'll see Warburton struggling with. It's the old ways that I just examined in that introduction down at the bottom of page 95. Um, Miss Stackpole tells me it's my bounden duty and that it's hers to see I do mine. She has a great sense of duty, said Isabel gravely. She has indeed, and it's the motive of everything she does. That's what I like her for. She thinks it's very frivolous for you to be single. That's what she meant to express to you. If you thought if you thought she was trying to attract you, you were very wrong. There was a kind of a misunderstanding about that. She's not. She just doesn't get the finer elements of decorum. Something that sometimes Americans are still accused of. Remember, I told you that somebody observed me one time that you can always tell Americans in Europe, American women in Europe, because they wear tennis shoes and they often go about alone. But it's a very strange type at the top of 96. She is too personal, considering that she expects other people not to be. She walks in without knocking at the door. So um, she's often brash and maybe a little vulgar. Um, well, said Isabel, smiling. I'm afraid it is because she is rather vulgar that I like her. As she doesn't get the finer European ways. Um, let's see, down at the bottom of page 96 at the end of the second last paragraph. So long as I look at the Mrs. Molyneux, they seem to me to answer a kind of ideal. Then Henrietta presents herself, and I am immensely struck with her, not so much for herself as what stands behind her. Um, so we've got these Mrs. Molyneux, those are the Warburton sisters, who are often portrayed in idealistic terms. And Isabel, much like them, and then Henrietta bursts onto the scene, and Isabel likes her as well. So she is much more flexible and aware and accepting than we'll see Henrietta be later on. And she says at the end, um, she has a strong, sweet, fresh odor seems to rise from Henrietta. Excuse my simile, it has something of that odor in her garments, her Americanism. At the end of the paragraph, the end of the chapter, I'm not sure the Pacific is blue, he said, but you are a woman of imagination. Henrietta, however, is fragrant. Henrietta is decidedly fragrant of America. So the points in this chapter are the way that the Brits see Americans and how Americans see the Brits. Decidedly, the English versus the Americans. We see a contrast of Isabel and how she is able to fit in better than Henrietta is. Um, Henrietta perhaps is braver than Isabel. She is inclined to judge and is inclined to hold her prejudices. In the next chapter on page 98, the question when we enter this paragraph and in many subsequent paragraphs is how will Isabel respond to her experiences? Let's see, where am I? Her situation in Gardencourt, therefore, appreciated as we have seen her to be by Isabel, and full of appreciation of herself, of that fine freedom of composition, which, to her sense, rendered Isabel's character a spirit, a sister spirit, and of an easy venerableness of Mr. Touchette, with general tone, as she said, met with her full approval. Um, so there, like with much of Henry James, especially in this novel, we're examining people set in situations and responding to other characters. Down at the bottom of 98, if you could see none but the people I like, my dear, you would have very small society, Mrs. Touchette frankly admitted, and I don't think I like any man or woman well enough to recommend them to you. When it comes to recommending, it is a serious affair. I don't like Miss Stackpole. I don't like her tone. She talks too loud, and she looks at me too hard. And you can imagine that Henrietta is indeed trying to figure out Mrs. Touchette. Mrs. Touchette thinks she's just vulgar and brash. Miss Stackpole knows that I detest boarding house civilizations. Middle class. She hates the middle class. At the bottom of page 99, poor American ladies, cried Mrs. Touchette with a laugh. They are the slaves of slaves. Um, she has some very real prejudices, and one of them is against the middle class. She says that women in America are the companions of freemen. Look over on the top of page 100. What she's saying is that American women just get right on in there and help their servants. They are the companions of their servants, the Irish chambermaid and the Negro waiter. They share their work. That's a European prejudice against people who need to work. Do you call the domestics in an American household slaves, Miss Stackpole inquired? If that's the way you desire to treat them, no wonder you don't like America. Notice Henrietta's name, Stackpole. It's as if she has some sort of job. She stacks poles. She doesn't really, but she does have a job as a journalist. Um, about halfway down the page, and this was the only reward that Ruoff got for his compliment. Miss Stackpole was baffled. She is. She's baffled. Um, Over on page 101, she happens to mention that Mr. Goodwood came out in the steamer with me. This is that we've heard about him from earlier in the novel. This is the suitor that Isabel had when she had before she left Albany. I've got some sort of there was some sort of consternation going on out there, but apparently it has stopped. I'm just going to stop. I think this has resumed. It says resumed. Um, Kino, my little guy, got his head stuck in the fence. So that's what he was squealing about. I think by the time I got out there, it was already, the problem was solved. But, it's kind of scary when they squeal. Okay, so anyway, Mr. Goodwood has made his way across the sea, perhaps to see Isabel. So this is her suitor in Albany, and she seems as if she was not too inclined to encourage him. At the bottom of page 101, I'm very sorry for that. He thinks too well of me already. He ought not to be encouraged. Oh, she doesn't. She doesn't encourage him. She's not inclined. He is very simple-minded, said Isabel, and he is not so ugly. There's nothing so simple as a great passion, says Henrietta. It is not a great passion. I'm very sure it is not that. Next page. Henrietta has a fear that Isabel is changing. And she says, yes, you are changed on 102. You have got new ideas over here. And Isabel said, well, I hope so. One should get as many new ideas as possible. Yes, but they shouldn't interfere with the old one. I think this is a very interesting conversation because Henrietta is resisting learning in this pretty dramatically different environment. She doesn't want Isabel to change. Over on page 103, this time her companion was grave. Well, I don't care. You have changed, she replied. You are not the girl you were a few short weeks ago, and Mr. Goodwood will see it. I expect him here any day. Henrietta's pretty presumptuous. I hope he will hate me then, says Isabel. Next paragraph. To this observation, our heroine made no rejoinder. She was absorbed in feeling of alarm given her by Henrietta's intimation that Caspar Goodwood would present himself at Gardencourt. Here she is sitting in what appears to be a complete separation from her old environment. And here comes Caspar Goodwood. She feels as if she's oppressed. The feeling was oppressive. It made the air sultry, as if there were to be a change of weather. Notice this metaphor. The weather, socially speaking, had been so agreeable during Isabel's stay at Gardencourt that change would be for the worse. Change in the person of Goodwood. She formed down at the bottom, among the flickering shadows, a very graceful and harmonious image, as if it were one of the paintings, one of the landscapes. Um, and those beautiful landscapes of the period often have um, um, changes of weather in them. If we look over on page 104, notice how many times we see Isabel holding a book. It seemed to her at last that she would do well to take a book. Formerly, when she felt heavy-hearted, and she is now because Goodwood's coming along, she had been able, with the help of some well-chosen volume, to transfer the seat of consciousness to the organ of pure reason. Of late, however, it had not been denied. Literature seemed a fading light. Oh, can you imagine? but it's not distracting her from this disruption. If Down at the bottom is a copy of the letter that Casper sends to Miss Archer. Um, but you disappointed it. I found you changed, and you were able to give me no reason for the change. Um, and it was the only concession you would make, but it was a very cheap one because you are not unreasonable. So he's trying to reason with her to come back to him. Um, at the top of 105, Isabel read Mr. Goodwood's letter with such profound attention that she had not perceived an approaching tread on the soft grass. Looking up, however, as she mechanically folded the paper, she saw Lord Warburton standing before her. Well, that's interesting, isn't it? James really is. We're now going to see Warburton, and we're going to see his development, his characterization. That's a better word. On page 106. Isabel had got up. She felt a wish for the moment that he should not sit down beside her. I was just going indoors, she said. So you can see that she's putting up barriers right away. Please don't do that. It's a much pleasanter here, he says. I have ridden over from Lockley. It is a lovely day. His smile was peculiarly friendly and pleasing, and his whole person seemed to admit that radiance of good feeling and good fare which had formed the charm of the girl's first impression on him. It surrounded him like a zone of fine June weather. So, even early on here, we know that Warburton is a good man. Um, he says, "We will walk about a little then," or she says this, said Isabel, who could not divest herself of the sense of an intention on the part of her visitor, and who wished both to elude the intention and to satisfy her curiosity regarding it. Well, we know what his intention is. Down at the bottom, this alarm was composed of several elements, not all of which were disagreeable. She had indeed spent some days in analyzing them, and had succeeded in separating the pleasant part of this idea of Lord Warburton's making love to her from the painful. It may appear to some readers that the young lady was both precipitate and unduly fastidious. Um, so James is suggesting to us that maybe she's a little presumptuous in thinking that Lord Warburton is on the edge of doing something that she doesn't want him to do. Ask her to marry him. Top of 107. At the risk of making the reader smile, it must be said that there had been moments when the intimation that she was admired by a personage struck her as an aggression which she would rather have spared. Um, she had never known a personage before. There were no personages in her native land. We know that. Um, when she had thought of such matters as this, she had done so on the basis of character, of what one liked in a gentleman's mind and in his talk. But now she's faced with this lord, and she doesn't really even know what to make of him. Lord Warburton loomed up before her largely and brightly as a collection of attributes and powers which were not to be measured by this simple rule. But which demanded a different sort of appreciation. She's a little out of her element here because she doesn't even know how to respond to this personage. A few lines later, what she felt was that a territorial, a political, a social magnate had conceived the design of drawing her into the system in which he lived and moved. It's his system, not hers. A certain instinct, not imperious but pervasive, told her to resist it. It murmured to her that virtually she had a system and an orbit of her own. That's true. It told her other things besides, things which both contradicted and confirmed each other. That a girl might do much worse than trust herself to a man such as Warburton, and that it would be very interesting to see something of his system from his own point of view. That, on the other hand, and here's the contrast, there was evidently a great deal of it which she should regard only as an encumbrance, and that even in the whole there was something heavy and rigid which would make it unacceptable. And there is what Gora was telling us, that the old system in England is a kind of rigidity, and that's what she is sensing on the next page. Oh, I think it starts on the previous page. Oh yeah. Furthermore, wait. Oh yeah. Furthermore, there was a young man lately come from America who had no system at all. So that's Casper. He's coming with the same kind of system she has. And then at the end of this paragraph, she was a person of great good faith, and if there was a great deal of folly in her wisdom, those who judge her severely may have the satisfaction of finding that later she became consistently wise only at the cost of an amount of folly which will constitute almost a direct appeal to charity. That is a really important bit of information from Henry James. That the so you should that's something that we will revisit later on in the novel. This really that needs 2 stars. In the middle of the next big paragraph, the English are the most romantic people in the world, and Lord Warburton was about to give an example of it. The young lady who trod the turf beside him had come from a queer country across the sea, and that's what they thought. Down at the bottom of this page, he had summed all this, the perversity of the impulse, which had declined to avail himself of the most liberal opportunities to subside, and the judgment of mankind as exemplified particularly in the more quickly judging half of it. He had looked at these things well in the face, and then he had dismissed them from his thoughts. So he's pretty high up in the social and cultural um, ladder. And he recognizes that for him, it might be a detriment to marry this woman from America. And he's dismissed it. He knows what his friends are going to say, and he's dismissed it. Um, Down at the bottom of page 109. And moreover, if anything beside the sense that she had already acquired that Lord Warburton was not a frivolous person had been needed to convince her, the tone in which he replied to her would quite have served the purpose. One's right in such a matter is not measured by the time, Miss Archer. It is measured by the feeling of it. So we're getting a window into Warburton. Um, he seems genuine. And on the next page, 110. Nevertheless, I'm about 10 lines down. Nevertheless, I made up my mind to think it over and to question myself narrowly. I have done so. All these days I have thought of nothing else. I don't make mistakes about such things. I am a very judicious fellow. I don't go off easily, but when I am touched, it's for life. It's for life, Miss Archer. It's for life. So he's conveying his sincerity, and we, the reader, think he is sincere. Down in the next page, well, I'm on page 110, towards about a quarter of the way up. If you will be my wife, then I shall know you. When I tell you all the good I think of you, you will not be able to say it from ignorance. It's an interesting bit of insight here. We have seen this in other novels and in other some of the other fiction we have read, that one marries and then gets to know your spouse. At least the expectation to marry was so strong because and we've investigated this. The opposite, to be left a spinster, is to be a bit of a social outcast. Um, Page 111. What should she say? Had she asked herself. Her foremost wish was to say something as nearly as possible as kind as what he had said to her. His words had carried perfect conviction in them. She felt that he loved her. I thank you more than I can say for your offer, she rejoined at last. It does me great honor. But we know she's going to let him down, or at least try to let him down easily. And he says, or she says down at the bottom, don't hope too much. Oh, Miss Archer, her companion murmured, smiling again in his seriousness, as if such a warning might perhaps be taken but as the play of high spirits, the coquetry of elation. He thinks she's kidding. She's not kidding. She's turning him down. And he's a little befuddled by it because he knows he's a good catch. We know he's a good catch because we've been offered everything about him, including insight into his character. The top of page 112. And I say that not in the least out of conventional modesty. It is perfectly sincere that she's turning him down. Middle of this page, 112. Don't mind. I would much rather have a good answer 6 months hence than a bad one today. But it is very probable, she says, that even 6 months hence I should not be able to give you one that you would think is good. He says he's just going to wait. Um, it is not what I ask, it is what I can give. I don't think I should suit you. I really don't think I should. Um, she just doesn't think it's going to work. It is not only that, said Isabel, but I am not sure I wish to marry anyone. We're going to hear her say that. But they are frequently persuaded, she says. Lots and lots of people might say they don't want to get married, but then they're persuaded that they do. And it's because of the position of women at the time. Um, she says in response to that, that is because they want to be persuaded. I'm afraid it's my being an Englishman. He's going to try and figure out what is it that she doesn't like. Um, I'm afraid it's my being an Englishman that makes you hesitate. He says presently. I know your uncle thinks you ought to marry in your own country. Then over on 113. Well, then, if you like it, I am more and more unable to see your objection to what I propose. I'm afraid I can't make you understand. And here's kind of the cultural class. Any Englishwoman in that country, and a young English woman in that country, in Isabel's position, she is unmarried, her parents are dead, and she's poor. He can't understand why she's not taking him up on this. Um, then he suggests maybe it's the climate. But though she could conceive the impulse, she could not let it operate. So she can see the appeal, but her imagination was charmed, but it was not led captive. Notice that is in the language of freedom. It's the opposite. What she finally bethought herself of saying was something very different, something which altogether deferred the need of answering. Do you think me unkind if I ask you to say no more about this today? Certainly, certainly, I would I would bore you for the world. On the top of page 114. Um, Isabel listened with an extreme respect to this admiration, but she said after a minute, I must tell you that what I shall think about is some way of letting you know that what you ask is impossible without making you feel miserable. She's not opening any possibility to this at all. She's just trying to say, I just have to think of a way to let you down nicely. He says, I shall not die of it, but I shall do worse. I shall live to no purpose. Now, at the bottom, about a third of the way up from the bottom, I shall not keep you in suspense. I only want to collect my mind a little bit. He gave a melancholy sigh and stood looking at her a moment with his hands behind him, giving short, nervous shakes to his hunting whip. Do you know I am very much afraid of? He said, do you know I am very much afraid of it, of that mind of yours? And then he says, maybe it's my house you don't like, Lockley. But we know she did like it. But if you shouldn't fancy it, you needn't dream of living in it. Oh, he's really pulling out his desperation. Page 115, about halfway down, she could not marry Lord Warburton. The idea failed to correspond to any vision of happiness that she had hitherto entertained or was now capable of entertaining. As we follow her, we're going to see that um, she's given to developing theories. And this is a theory of hers, what she envisions herself to do as she goes through life. But what disturbed her in the sense that it struck her with wonderment was that this very fact that it cost her so little to refuse a great opportunity, what with whatever qualifications one would, Lord Warburton had offered her a great opportunity. She gets that part down at the bottom. Why then upon her also should it not impose itself? Who was she? What was she that she should hold herself superior? What view of life would design upon fate? What conception of happiness had she pretended to be larger than this large occasion? If she would not do this, then she must do great things. She must do something greater. And so um, we see this in her that um, she tries not to be arrogant. I think it says at the top of the next page, 116, poor Isabel found occasion to remind herself from time to time that she must not be too proud. So, is that it? Is she too proud to marry him? Is she better than he is? Hang on. I don't know if this is on your screen. Okay. At the end of this paragraph, but this was not the case. She was wondering whether she were not a cold, hard girl. And when at last she got up and rather quickly went back to the house, it was because, as she had said to Lord Warburton, she was really frightened at herself. So she hasn't, now she's turned down this really great opportunity. In the middle of page 117, we see the weird arrangement between Mr. and Mrs. Touchette. It's a weird marriage. Isabel had quite taken her place in the class so designated, which for the rest included the old man's son, his physician. These are her group of people. He calls them his cronies. Um, his personal servant, and even Miss Stackpole. Everybody's there except for Mrs. Touchette, who is not considered one of his cronies. I think she's kind of entertaining, don't you think? So she goes in there to talk to Mr. Touchette because they're close and um, he's a good source of guidance. And she tells him that Warburton has proposed and that she has turned him down. Very highly indeed, said Isabel, but at the cost of seeming ungrateful. I don't think I can marry Mr. Lord Warburton. And then a third of the way from the bottom. I like him extremely. I am very free to admit that, but I don't wish to marry anyone just now. In one of the later chapters for today, we'll see her articulating why. I mean, even I can see that this is a pretty good match. So what's the deal, Isabel? It's the late 1800s. You can't be a spinster. That's what I was thinking to myself. Bottom of page 119. Um, let's see. Oh no, this is the top of 119. Mr. Touchette says you didn't find it sufficiently attractive, and she says, I suppose it was that, she presently admitted, but I don't know why. And then at the bottom of page 119, um, let's see, this suggestion gave her something more definite to rest upon than she had found in her own thoughts. Oh, he says, perhaps you also might have too much to pay. That's, yeah, that's probably part of it. And she says, she's hoping that she isn't really too fickle. Am I too fussy? Um, with her dilemma seemed to prove to her that she was concerned with the natural and reasonable emotions of life and not altogether a victim to intellectual eagerness and vague ambitions. Ambitions reaching beyond Lord Warburton's handsome offer to something indefinable and possibly not commendable. Um, yeah, it would cost her too dearly. So at the bottom, we see what about a union with Caspar Goodwood? Well, we're going to investigate that presently. 121 at the top. She liked at any rate this idea of being potentially a commander of men. This is a description now of Caspar, and as is typical of Henry James, when we are taken to the interior of a character, we get these really big paragraphs. But it's a really fine development of Caspar Goodwood. Caspar, it turns out, is a pretty good choice too. He's a little bit of a stick in the mud. He's Goodwood, as wood signifies. But I also thought to myself, this is something similar to young Goodman Brown. They were all called Goody. She's from Albany, which is where that term was in use a century or even 2 centuries earlier. So it just to me, it had that puritanic American feel to it. His He wore a similar outfit every day. It probably was a different outfit, but she was not in love with him. He was too serious. Down at the bottom of 122, Caspar Goodwood had never corresponded to her idea of a delightful person. Again, she has some sort of theory that she hasn't really flushed out. And she supposed that this was why he was so unsatisfactory. When, however, Lord Warburton, who not only did correspond with it, but gave an extension to the term, appealed to her approval, she found herself still unsatisfied. It was certainly strange, she thought to herself. Next paragraph, Isabel had a personal shrinking from entertaining two lovers at once, even in a case where the entertainment should consist of dismissing them. So she is not fickle, and she's not trying to misuse them. She tells him in a correspondence, we see our lives from our own point of view. That is the privilege of the weakest and humblest of us, and I shall never be able to see mine in the manner you proposed. She's letting him down. Um, she, while the author of this missive was making up her mind to dispatch it, Henrietta Stackpole formed a resolution which was accompanied by no hesitation. Miss Stackpole is indiscreet. She's managing the Caspar Goodwood like he's a marionette in this whole situation. Um, Henrietta says on page 124, I was brought up with different customs and ideas. I am not used to your arbitrary standards. That's how she defines them. And yet, if you are in the culture, the standards are not arbitrary. Um, like the ladies being escorted, like Mrs. Touchette declining to allow Isabel to sit in the parlor with Warburton and Ralph. In the middle of the next paragraph on 124. But I think on the whole I would rather be myself than you. I am quite content to be myself. I don't want to change. There are plenty of people that appreciate me just as I am. It is true, they are only Americans. That's Henrietta's view of, and we're going to learn that Henrietta is not very adaptable. Um, but she's interesting because she's a woman who has a career. She says at the end of this paragraph, I want you to help me about Isabel. Um, so she's gone to Ralph, and she says, I'm afraid she's going to injure herself. So in other words, this goes back to this idea that Henrietta is convinced that Isabel is changing, not in a good way. At the top of 125, but if you wish to be serious once in your life, here's a chance. And if you really care for your cousin, here's an opportunity to prove it. And then there is a um, reference to the characters in The Tempest, as if this is a storm, right? Um, I find her fearfully changed. And then I wrote in the margin, what is so bad with change? And here's where Henrietta, even in her name, it seems kind of rigid. Do you want to change her back again? Says Ralph. And she says, of course I do, and I want you to help me. And she says, you were Prospero enough to make her what she became. You have created on Isabel Archer since she came here, Mr. Touchette. And down at the continuation of the reference to The Tempest, as if she magically changed her. Next paragraph. You are too passive then. You had better stir yourself and be careful. Isabel is changing every day. She is drifting away, right out to sea. I have watched her and I can see it. She is not the bright American girl she was. She is taking different views and turning away from her old ideals. I want to save those ideals, Mr. Touchette, and that is where you come in. As if the new American ideals are somehow more pure. At the bottom, I have got a fear in my heart that she is going to marry one of those Europeans, and I want to prevent it. Why does she Why is she taking that role? I thought to myself. Next page on 126. That a young woman should demand that a gentleman whom she described as her very dear friend should be furnished with an opportunity to make herself agreeable to another young woman whose attention had wandered and whose charms are greater. This is an anomaly which for the moment challenged all his ingenuity of interpretation. Henrietta is violating the protocol. You can't just make this work. And he thought not so much of a vulgar, but of an embarrassed mind. Um, Ralph doesn't really want to do this. Over on page 127. Well, I suppose you haven't heard of everyone. I don't believe he has ever heard of you, but that is no reason why Isabel should marry him. And then a few lines later, is she very fond of him? She isn't. If she isn't, she ought to be. He is simply wrapped up in her. This is Caspar. um, mid-page. He is the only man I have ever seen whom I think worthy of Isabel. And then at the bottom of 127, he is just the opposite of you. He is the head of a cotton factory, a very fine one. So there we have the contrast between an American and a European. The hard work versus nobility, aristocracy. Top of the next page. Um, she asks him if he's a nice guy, and she says he has splendid manners in the American style, um, which shows Henrietta's rigidity. Um, Isabel is capable of absorbing and learning. Um, and how would my cousin like this? And she says, very possibly not at all, but it would be good for her. It will call her back to her thoughts. At the top of page 129. So Henrietta wants Ralph to invite Caspar Goodwood to Garden Court. And that is not appropriate. First of all, it's Mr. Touchette's estate. And then Ralph can't act to bring someone who's pursuing Isabel to the property. Well, said Ralph, to prove to you that you are wrong, I will invite him. It must be, of course, as a friend of yours. Over on page 130, that if Mr. Goodwood were interested in Isabel in a serious manner described by Miss Stackpole, he would not care to present himself at Garden Court on a summons from the latter lady. On this supposition, he must regard her as a thorn on the stem of his rose. As an intercessor, he must find her wanting intact. Really, he can't go there without being invited by Isabel. Over at the bottom of page 131. And Henrietta was a literary woman, the great advantage of which being a literary woman was that you could go everywhere and do everything. She's one of these new women. Ralph, who burst into a fit of laughter which did not express the sympathy she had desired. Um, I just don't even know what that word says. I wrote it. Down at the bottom, do you mean it improper? Dear me, isn't anything proper here? With Henrietta, surely I may go anywhere. She isn't hampered in that way. She has traveled over the whole world, American continent, and she can surely find her way about this simple little island. See, little island. And then said Ralph, let me take advantage of her protection to go up to town as well. I may never have a chance to travel so safely. He's making fun of her. If we go to the next chapter, about 10 lines down, there was something in these delays and postponements that touched the girl and renewed her sense of his desire to be considerate and and um and patient, not to appear to urge her too grossly, a discretion the more striking that she was so sure he really liked her. So he's trying. This is Caspar Ghostwood. What's his name? I forgot. Caspar, anyway. Um, he is trying not to pressure her, as Warburton was trying not to pressure her. This personage, Warburton, drove over from Lockley and brought the elder of his sisters with him, a measure presumably dictated by considerations of the same order as Mr. Touchette's. So we know that Isabel liked those ladies, and so he can come over with her to bring the sister to talk to Isabel, not about the marriage proposal, just because they're friendly. However, you can see that Warburton is uncomfortable. He can't even meet her eye. There's Miss Molyneux. Interesting that Miss Molyneux has she's as smooth as a nun's. She's not really doesn't have very many troubles. She's also wearing this big crucifix, as if she, and I read this in the note, that speculates she is a member of this mysterious order of Anglican women that has met a resurgence lately. Not our lately, but in that situation. He was fond of her and kind to her, but on the whole, he told her little, the sister. Such as, at least, was Isabel's theory. Again, when at table, she was not occupied in conversation. She was usually occupied in forming theories about her neighbors. Um, but we see on the following page, 135, the contrasting American and British point of view. I don't care much at the top, says Henrietta, about European potatoes. I thought that was funny. I shouldn't know you from an ordinary American gentleman. Um, do talk to me as if I were, said Lord Warburton. He's always trying to deflect attention away from his aristocratic stature. So just talk to me like I'm an American guy. Next few lines. I have hardly any appetite since I've been here, she went on at last. So it doesn't much matter. I don't approve of you, you know. I feel as if I ought to tell you that. Sometimes she just is indiscreet. And then in the next paragraph, I would never have said that to anybody, I don't think, unless I really didn't. Um, I don't approve of Lords as an institution. Here's the problem, she said. I think the world has got beyond that, far beyond. And we see this contrasting view. She's, in this case, representing a newer world order. Um, she says, why don't you give up your lordshipness? Oh, I'm so little of one. One would really forget all about it if you wretched Americans were not constantly reminding of one. However, I do think of giving up the little there is left of it one of these days. He has considered the weirdness of his position. Down at the bottom, well, Miss Stackpole, I'd like to see all sides. I don't approve of a privileged class. This is Miss Stackpole is saying this. But I like to hear what they have got to say for themselves. Again, a specimen. Um, she seems to be without any real understanding of Warburton as a person. 136. We neither of us have any position to speak of, but she is better off than I because she has none of the bother. Um, this is the sister. So he has all of the bother because he's the one who inherited the title. The Silver Cross is worn by eldest daughters of viscounts. So her conception, Isabel's conception that she was really just south of being a nun, is not in fact true. Over on the top of page 137, if I could believe it, of course, I should let you alone, but we can't believe by willing it, and I confess I don't understand. I could understand your disliking me, that I could understand well, but that you should admit what you do? What have I admitted? Said Isabel. You don't seem to have any reason, and that gives me a sense of injustice. He just can't figure out why she would turn him down. He's just really a good catch. And she says, you make me very unhappy. And then down at the bottom, he keeps searching for answers. He can't figure this out. Is it my political opinions? Do you think I go too far? I can't object to your political opinions, Lord Warburton, said the girl, because I don't understand them. And therein kind of lies the crux. Neither one really understands the other. If you go over to um, page 138, It's not my fate, Isabel says. I know it is not. It's not my fate to give up, and I know it can't be. Remember what Touchette said? Are you going to pay too dearly? Well, in fact, she's beginning to articulate this. Um, do you call marrying me giving up? Not in the usual sense. It is getting a great deal, but it is giving up other chances. And other chances? What do you mean? Other men? He doesn't get it. Down at the bottom, I don't think it is presumptuous in me to say that I think you will gain more than you will lose, said Lord Warburton. I can't escape unhappiness, said Isabel. In marrying you, I shall be trying to. In other words, marrying him would be too easy. It's too easy. And she has said in the past that she never really suffered. And not that anybody wants to suffer, but it develops one. She says, I must not. I can't. And on 139 at the top, whatever charms unhappiness may have for you, it has none for me. And she retorts, I'm not bent on being miserable. I have always been intensely determined to be happy, and I have often believed I should be. I have told people that. You can ask them, but it comes over me every now and then that I can never be happy in an extraordinary way, not by turning away, by separating myself. By separating yourself from what? He asks. From life, from the usual chances and dangers, from what most people know and suffer. So there it is. And then a few lines later, all I offer you is the chance of taking the common lot in a comfortable sort of way. The common lot? Why, I am devoted to the common lot. Strike an alliance with me, and I promise you, you shall have plenty of it. So he's got enough maturity and insight to know that even if she marries him, that there will be suffering. Stuff will happen. It does. Then down at the bottom, towards the bottom, are we speaking of Miss Stackpole, Lord Warburton? Asked impatiently. I never saw a person judge things on such theoretic grounds. Well, we think that's probably true. Um, so over on page 140, down at the bottom of the page, Isabel looked into her quiet eyes a moment. This is Miss Molyneux. Um, and for that moment seemed to see in their gray depths the reflection of everything she had rejected in rejecting Lord Warburton: the peace, the kindness, the honor, the possessions, a deep security, and a great exclusion. It's the exclusion that she's worried about. Um, she says, I'm not coming back to Lockley because I'm going away. Towards a few lines later, I should like to see you at home, said Henrietta, whom Lord Warburton found beside them. I should like an hour's talk with you. There are a great many questions I wish to ask you. Always the reporter, collecting another specimen. Um, she says, this is Henrietta, I am determined to get some satisfaction out of you. She was trying to understand each one of these people. This one happens to be Lord Warburton. Down at the bottom of 141, Lord Warburton was at a loss. He had not been made acquainted with Miss Stackpole's professional character and did not catch her allusions. Over on the next page, uh, Miss Stackpole, Ralph observed, takes notes. She is a great satirist. She sees through us all and works us all up like a big experiment. Then over at the end of this chapter, neither am I, after all, especially when you smile that way. One would think you had carried off a prize. I suppose that when you refuse an offer like Lord Warburton, it's because you expect to do something better. The implication is perhaps she expects to get a better husband choice. But what she really is thinking is she expects to do something larger, more in life. So she's, in fact, rejecting the fate that society expects that she marry. Next chapter. Um, let's see. at the top of page 145. Only the great next great offer you get, I hope you will manage to come up. It will. This is Mrs. Touchette. I hope it will manage to come up to your standards. She's thinking the same thing, that Isabel thinks she'll get a better prospect. You probably won't be troubled with them if you adopt permanently the bohemian manner of life. In other words, separated from convention. Um, Next few paragraphs, Ralph had assured her that there would be no violation of decency in their paying a visit, the little party of three, to the sights of the metropolis. But Mrs. Touchette took a different view. Like many ladies of her country who have lived a long time in Europe, she had completely lost her native tact on such points, and in her reaction, not in itself deplorable, against the liberty allowed to young persons beyond the seas, had fallen into gratuitous and exaggerated scruples. We've seen this from Mrs. Touchette, that she seems to have exaggerated uh, modes of decorum. She's Ralph and Henrietta and Isabel want to go to London and see the sights. Okay, on the next page, 146. I suppose you mean that their aristocracy is absent. So Ralph notices that there's not much of his people in London. It's mostly poor people and middle class people. But I don't think you could have a better proof of that. If they were absent altogether, they would not be missed. It seems to me the place is about as full as it could be. There is no one here, of course, except for 3 or 4 million people. So Henrietta's pretty blunt in taking him to task for not noticing the middle class and the lower class are in fact there. At the top of page 147, if she had come in search of local color, she found it everywhere. That's interesting because this is the time when local color was a genre in the United States, and now she's looking for it. So James has used that phrase deliberately, and I think there was a note to that effect. She asked more questions than he could answer and launched little theories that he was equally unable to accept or refute. This next section is about the beauty of Kensington Gardens. Interestingly, I went to college at Kensington College, and there was a campus right near Kensington Gardens, and it was right near Hyde Park. I just thought that was a little aside. Um, I think that's where I became really interested in history and reading. I was always kind of bookish anyway. At the end of this big paragraph on 147, they talk about going to the National Galleries, and the landscapes by Turner and the Assyrian Bowls were a poor substitute for the literary dinner parties at which she had hoped to meet the genius and renown of Great Britain. So, looking at this kind of historical background in which this is Henrietta, she still wants to collect and write stories about people, which Isabel has told her would be indiscreet. And so then they're in Trafalgar Square, and she doesn't get the importance of Lord Nelson. That's the past. I don't care about the past, she says. I want to see some of the leading minds of the present. Um, is a state of things which appeared to Miss Stackpole to indicate a deplorable want of enterprise. Or at the top, let's see, in the middle of page 148, um, nevertheless, mingled with this absence of intellectual relish of it was a feeling of freedom which in itself was sweet, and which, as she wandered through the great cities with her ill-matched companions, occasionally throbs into joyous excitement. When she walked into Kensington Gardens, she stopped the children, mainly of the poorer sort, whom she saw playing in the glass, and she gave them a sixpenny. But so Isabel is relishing this journey, whereas by contrast, Isabel thinks there's specimens in people to gather and write about. Um, then, if we look over at page 149, I know just what you want. You want a house where they go in for theatricals and picnics and that sort of thing. That is what she's looking for. I am sure she'll ask you down by return post. She's tremendously fond of distinguished peoples and writers. She writes herself, and then there's a mention of Byron here. She writes probably quite a lot like Byron, but the interesting thing about Byron is that he was surrounded by scandals. And that's exactly what Isabel, what's her name, Henrietta wants. The Touchettes are not English at all, you know. They live on a kind of foreign system. They have got some awfully queer ideas. The old man thinks it's wicked to hunt, I'm told. Those are some of his queer ideas. Then on 150, um, so this, what's his name? Bantling. This is this person that she's starting to talk to. He was part of their group, and um, so she's hoping that Bantling's sister, Lady Pencil, will invite her to their place. And let's see, she's Baron's wife, a convenient sort of rank. You are fine enough, and you are not too fine. And then if you look over on 141, there's a reference here. Henrietta notices, I suppose you mean it's improper for me to walk alone. And yes, it is improper. And everybody tries to keep getting her into a cab. Send her on a cab, by the way. Bantling wants to accompany her, but she's not having it. On the top of 152, I call Henrietta a very brilliant woman, but I don't think it will go far, she rejoined. Oh, that's because Ralph has says she has made a conquest. He thinks her a brilliant woman. It may go far. Always looking to see who's marriageable. It's not going to go far, says Isabel. They would never really know each other. He has not the least idea what she really is, and she has no real comprehension of Mr. Bantling. Maybe echoes the reason that Isabel has turned down Lord Warburton. Down at the bottom, there's a little bit of description of Bantling. For the moment, however, he liked immensely being alone with her in the thickening dusk in the center of the multitudinous town. It made her seem to depend on him and to be in his power. This power he could exert but vaguely. They both but the best exercise of it was to accept her decision submissively. There was almost an emotion in doing that. That's what Isabel and Ralph were sitting together, and he has consented to do as she has asked, which conversely allows him a little bit of power. On page 153, you were reserved for my future. You must remember that my past is over there across the water. There is none of it here in London. Okay, at the top of 154, there is something I should very much like to say to you, says Ralph. It is a question I wish to ask. It seems to me I have a right to ask because I have a kind of interest in the answer. Well, I don't know about you. I haven't read this novel. Well, I read it this summer, but the first time I went here, I was thinking, Ralph's going to propose. Oh my gosh. But that's not where he's going. He says, and let's see, I hope you won't mind my saying that Warburton has told me of something that has passed between you. So everybody seems to know everybody's business in this little tiny community. Um, but she objects. She says, "Well, I don't mind that he told you, but here's my reasoning. I have only met him 5 or 6 times." She says at the bottom of 154, top of third of the way down in 155. What had you in your mind when you refused him, Lord Warburton? What was the logic, the view of your situation that dictated so remarkable an act? And she said, I didn't wish to marry him, if that's the logic. All right, fair enough. Um, then why do you call it a remarkable act? And that's what your mother thinks. And he says, Warburton is such a fine fellow. He unites the intrinsic and the extrinsic advantages. He has everything. I refused him because he is too perfect then. I am not perfect myself. He is too good for me. Besides, his perfection would irritate me. She's just trying to figure this out. And this chapter is about her articulating these ideas. I said that as regards that position, whoops, wait, I think I said that as regards that position, he was rather a skeptic. It would have been in your power to make him a believer. She says, I think not. I don't understand the matter. I am not conscious of any mission of that sort. And then a few lines later, I'm glad for myself, she says. And then, oh, that was Ralph. And then down at the bottom of this page, what I mean is, I shall have the entertainment of seeing what a young lady does who won't marry Lord Warburton. Um, and he thinks that he'll probably see whatever happens to her. But don't forget, there's always the possibility that the TB will get him first. If you were to marry our friend, you would still have a career, a very honorable and brilliant one. But relatively speaking, it would be a little prosaic. It would be definitely marked out in advance. It would be wanting in the unexpected. You know, I'm extremely fond of the unexpected, and now that you have kept the game in your hands, I depend on your giving us a magnificent example of it. So she knows that England and Europe are devoted to these old standards, and that she's beginning to articulate this in her head. I do understand very well, but I do so well enough to be able to say that if you look for the magnificent examples of anything, I shall disappoint you. You will do so only by disappointing yourself, and that will go hard with you. Star that. That will go hard with you. To this, Isabel made no direct reply. There was an amount of truth in it which would bear consideration. At last she said abruptly, I don't see what harm there is in my wishing not to tie myself. I don't want to begin life by marrying. There are other things a woman can do. That's the point. There are other things a woman can do. And Ralph says, you want to see life, as the young men say. And she said, but I do want to look about me. You want to drain the cup of experience. No, I don't wish to touch the cup of experience. It is a poisoned drink. I only want to see for myself. You want to see, but not to feel. She says, I too don't wish to marry until I've seen Europe. That's Henrietta. And then at the top of page 158, sometimes I can't see these numbers. You have told me a great thing, that the world interests you and that you want to throw yourself into it. I think you meant it. She says, I don't know what you're trying to fasten upon me, for I am not in the least an adventurous spirit. Women are not like men. Next paragraph. No, he said, women rarely boast of their courage. Men do so with a certain frequency. Men have to boast of. Women have it too. You have a great deal. And then at the bottom of this page, when people forget I am sick, this is Ralph. When people forget I am a sick man, I am often annoyed. He said, but it's worse when they remember it. When they remember I am sick. So she has dismissed him by sending him home to go to bed. That makes him mad. So I'm just going to continue a little bit here. I'm trying really hard not to get pathetically behind, as I often do. If we go right on into the next chapter, Isabel had no hidden motive in wishing her cousin not to take her home. It simply seemed to her that for some days past she had consumed an inordinate quantity of his time, and the independent spirit of the American girl, who ends by regarding perpetual assistance as a sort of derogation to her sanity, had made her decide that for these few hours she must suffice to herself. She wants intervals of solitude. So again, she picks up a book. She sits trying to lose herself in a volume that she brought over from Garden Court, but she does not. And then a servant brings a card from Mr. Caspar Goodwood, excuse me, and he appears. Of course, we find out that Miss Stackpole let him know that she was there, and then they stood in on page 160 with a certain amount of defiance. Um, And then at the bottom of 160, Isabel made no answer to this. The sense of Henrietta Stackpole's treachery, as she momentarily qualified it, was strong within her. Henrietta is not delicate. It was a great liberty to take. So she's mad. She's mad that Henrietta revealed Isabel's location. And he's mad too. Casper's mad because Isabel didn't respond to Casper's inquiry, his letter. Isabel was not incapable of finding it agreeable to have an advantage of position over a person of this quality. And though she was not a girl to flaunt her advantage in his face, she was woman enough to enjoy being able to say, "You know, you ought not to have written to me yourself." They're kind of having a fight. Caspar Goodwood raised his eyes to her again. They wore an expression of ardent remonstrance. "Come on, you're supposed to respond." He had a strong sense of justice, and he was ready any day in that year, over and above this, to argue the question of rights, like Americans always do. My students in the jail are always talking about their rights as they sit there in orange, which I tell them. Page 162. So the argument continues. What good do you expect to get by insisting? And he says, the good of not losing you. And she says, you have no right to talk about losing what is not yours. And even from your point of view, Isabel added, you ought to know when to let one alone. Next paragraph. You displease me very much. And then a few lines later, Isabel knew that this was not a soft nature from which pinpricks would draw blood, and from the first of her acquaintance with him, and of her having to defend herself against a certain air that he had of knowing better what was good for her than she herself, she had recognized the fact that perfect frankness was her best weapon. So she feels controlled by him. And though he's another good prospect, he's an American with a factory, that's what bothers her. She's at the top of 163. If you would only try and banish me from your mind for a few months, we should be on better terms. So forget about the romantic part. And he says, because I'm in love with you. If one is strong, one loves only the more strongly. And she's trying to reason with him to let her go, but that isn't where his love for her comes from. But what will be my reward? Do you need a reward to act of generosity? Yes, when it involves a great sacrifice. So what do I get by leaving you go? I don't care. Will you marry me? That is the question. Assuredly not, she says. If I feel as if I as if I feel as I do at present, then I ask again, what do I gain by letting you go for a few 6 months? You will gain quite as much by worrying me to death. In other words, he's taking something from her. At the top of page 164, why do you make me say such things to you? She cried in a trembling voice. I only want to be gentle, to be kind. It is not delightful to me to feel that people care for me and yet to have to try and reason them out of it. That's exactly what she's doing. She's essentially saying it makes sense for you to do it this way because I'm not going to give in. I can't marry you simply to please you. That's right. Down at the bottom of 164. You will marry someone else, he says. Um, I told you just now that I don't wish to marry and that I shall probably never do so. I know you did, but I don't believe it, he says. And at the top of 165, again, she's articulating her thoughts about marriage. No, that is all that would be wanting, cried Isabel. You think you won't, but you will. Because remember, she said women are persuaded to marry. They think they're not going to, but they are persuaded to. Hold that thought. Let's see. At the end of this page 165, it is a fact, however, that it had always seemed to her that Caspar Goodwood, of all men, ought to enjoy the whole devotion of some tender woman. God forgive you, he murmured between his teeth, gritting his teeth. Her exclamation put her slightly in the wrong, and after a moment she felt the need to right herself, have the last word. Um, I should not be an easy victim. I've proved it. It's a little snotty. At the top of the next page, Isabel had hesitated to tell this story, but now she had begun. The satisfaction of speaking it out and doing herself justice took possession of her. So she's now going to tell the story about Warburton, and I turned him down too. Down at the the bottom of page 166, my very favorite word. She had virtually requested him to withdraw. He knew that, but at the risk of making himself odious to her, he kept his ground. She was far too dear to him to be easily forfeited. Yeah, he does seem to really care about her. You do me very little justice, she said. After my telling you what I told you just now, I'm sorry I told you, since it matters so little to you. He's not impressed. He doesn't know Lord Warburton, and he doesn't know that he was a good prospect. Over on 167, I received an invitation to your uncle's more than a week ago, and I declined it. And it was from Ralph. Of course, we know that we know the backstory. I declined it because I had not your authorization to accept it. The suggestion that Mr. Touchette should invite me appeared to have come from Miss Stackpole. So there's the reasoning he couldn't come. But I mentioned that. Um, if you declined, that was very proper of you. Thank you for it. It would have been so awkward for Lord Warburton if the two of them showed up simultaneously. Over on page 168, the attitude was part of a system, a theory that she had lately embraced. To be thorough, she said after a moment, don't think me unkind if I say that it's just that, being out of your sight, that I like. If you were in the same place as I should feel as if you were watching me. I don't like that. This is an important line. I like my liberty too much. If there is a thing in the world that I am fond of, Isabel went on, with a slight recurrence of the grandeur that was shown itself a moment before, it is my personal independence. So you see that how she has worked to this point where she can assert this. Down at the bottom of page 168, who would wish less to curtail your liberty than I? What can give me greater pleasure than to see you perfectly independent, doing whatever you like? It is to make you independent that I want to marry you. Boy, he's throwing out everything. With me, you will even be more independent, which probably has some truth to it. An unmarried woman, a girl of your age, is not independent. There are all sorts of things she can't do. She is hampered at every step. Mhm. Next few lines. I am not in my first youth, she says. I can do what I choose. I belong quite to the independent class. I have neither father nor mother. I am poor. I am of a serious disposition and not pretty. I therefore am not bound to be timid or conventional. Oh, so clear. Indeed, I can't afford such luxuries, but I try to judge things for myself. To judge wrong, I think, is more honorable than to not judge at all, like the sisters Molyneux. They don't judge anything. All they think, they just worship their brother. I don't wish to be a mere sheep in the flock, sisters Molyneux. I wish to choose my fate and know something of human affairs beyond what other people think is compatible and with propriety to tell me. At the end of this paragraph, let me say this to you, Mr. Goodwin. You are so kind as to speak of being afraid of my marrying. If you should hear a rumor that I am on the point of doing so, girls are liable to have such things said about them. Remember what I have told you about my love of liberty, and venture to doubt it. I don't want you to be conventional, he says. Do I strike you as as conventional myself? Do you want to improve your mind? Your mind is quite good enough for me, but if it interests you to wander about a while and see different countries, I shall be delighted to help you in any way in my power. One would think, he says, you were getting ready to commit a crime. She says, perhaps I am. I wish to be free even to do that if the fancy takes me. Quick now over on the next page, 170. She says, and remember, I promise nothing, absolutely nothing to you. I'm not promising to marry you. And remember, too, that I shall not be an easy victim. She thinks in those terms that if you marry, you are in some way a victim. You will get tired of your independence, he says. And then at the bottom of the page, um, he just says, he just sums up. But what I want you to know is that it has now taken two suitors to understand why she at this moment cannot marry. She had to articulate it in terms of a really good catch in the Lord Warburton, and another really good catch from America. Both of them offer security and goodness. They're both good people, and we see this from the narrator. And yet, here, by rejecting them and articulating her point of view, she now has a better understanding of what she needs, which is her independence. So I will stop here. I'm sure you're glad of that, but I was getting behind her, as my grandmother used to say. So we will pick up here on page 171 next week. That only puts me, I think, 6 pages behind. Brilliant. Oh, because if I get too behind, like you all know, it's really hard to catch up. And this is such a fabulous book. I hope you're enjoying it. I will um, I will tell you that if you have questions, you may ask them. Otherwise, I will see you next week.